Today's show, we're going to talk about what's behind me in this picture is these little miniature coffins that were discovered in Scotland in the 1800s. And it's a very little known story. Not too many people know about these interesting little coffins and their contents and sort of what or why these little things exist. And I think that we still don't really know why they exist. Really, it's kind of a guess.
It will be a mystery.
It's a bit of a guessing game, and people are, hypothesizing about what they think it's all about. But let's talk about why we chose this. I just thought it was a really fascinating subject. It's never talked about. I don't know if anybody's ever done a podcast on this, so we could be going down
the rabbit hole, as it were.
Down the rabbit hole. Yeah.
Down a rabbit hole.
Indeed.
They're known as the fairy coffins because of their size. They're very small. They're like 4 inches. So they're just little coffins. And each one of them has a little representation of a human body inside. Originally, it is said that 17 of them were found. So I'm going to discuss an article that came out in the London Times, because this is really where we first learn about these little objects and what they are and this strange discovery. So for me, oh my goodness, would I love to have these in my oddities collection?
Oh yes, I know you. You definitely would.
Yeah.
Oh,
they're very fascinating.
Even one would be phenomenal. But
yes.
Let me read this
of course
article. It's a little bit long, but it's not too long, and I'm going to read it off my phone, so just because it's there. But London Times, July 20, 1836. It says, that early in July 1836, some boys were searching for rabbit burrows down the rabbit hole for rabbit burrows in a rocky formation near Edinburgh, known as Arthur's Seat. In the side of a cliff, they came upon some thin sheets of slate, and they pulled them out. Little cave. 17 tiny coffins, 3 or 4 inches long. In the coffins were miniature wooden figures. They were dressed differently in both style and material. There were 2 tiers of 8 coffins each, and a third tier with 1 coffin. The extraordinary datum, which was especially made mystery here. So this is a direct quote. It says that the coffins had been deposited singularly in little cave at the intervals of many years. In the first tier, the coffins were quite decayed and the wrappings had moldered away. In the second tier, the effects of age had not advanced so far, and the top coffin was quite recent looking. So this is Fort, who used to write for the London Times, short account. It says it's so accurate. And as far as everything goes, in terms of the time, they believe that at that point, these little coffins were made in the late 1700s. Mm-hmm. So there was 17 coffins originally discovered. Mm-hmm. Today, there's only 8.
Oh,
I wonder where the rest
that's
are.
A shame.
Who has them in their collection? Come forward. I'm
looking. Check your ass attic, everybody.
I would love to know who has the other 9 of them in the collection, right? Because there's only 8. There was only ever 8. It says fewer than half of them survived. And the Scotsman, which is another newspaper, which first published the account, explained a number were destroyed by the boys pelting them at each other as unmeaning and contemptible trifles. So I guess the kids found them and then they were just throwing them down the hill at each other, and they ruined some of them. Those were brought down that still were intact from the hillside. They eventually found their way to a gentleman by the name of Robert Fraser. Now, this is a Fraser, Z-I-E-R, as opposed to Fraser, S-E-R. So we'll just note that that's a different spelling. He was a South Andrews street jeweler. So in Edinburgh, he had a jewelry shop. And he had these little coffins on display in his private museum. So when he retired in 1845, the collection was auctioned off.
Oh.
For a whopping £4. So in 18, that's a pretty
that was a lot of money, I imagine, back then.
Right? So we know that it's certainly
quite a lot
purchased by somebody who didn't have any money, right? You would have had to have some means. £4 was pretty good cost in those days. So the coffins thus passed into unknown private hands, and they remained there until 1901. So this is the 8 that we still have today, because the 9, presumably, the children ruined, but did they really? Maybe they only gave 8 of them away. So we don't really know, because there's not a lot of information on what happened to the other 9, other than that account of the kids throwing them down the hill at each other, just around. So we now have the National Museum of Scotland, who is in possession of these amazing little unique coffins that are 3 to 4 inches long. So what do you guys think about these? What do you think they are? And why were there 17 of them buried in 3 tiers, quite the ways up of the side of the hill?
Well,
over inside?
I don't know. I'm going to take a guess. I'm going to theorize here.
Right? So
I asked my husband what he thought of them, and he suggested that maybe they were symbolic of relatives that had deceased abroad, say in England, and they, obviously they couldn't bring the body home, so maybe they did a representation of that. Of the coffin and the person, the the relative that they lost.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. What do you think, Ian? Is there any?
Well, I've got some references here to some theories about that.
Right.
Okay. And this is sort of where my interest in all of this lays is in these theories.
Well, mine's in one of them for sure.
And I'm sure I'm going to touch on what you're going to mention.
You are.
But the first one I've got here is that, considering the time period, is that one theory says is that these were voodoo dolls used within a witchcraft type of thing.
Okay.
There is another theory that says that these were a tribute to sailors who were lost at sea in a shipwreck.
Okay.
And then there is a more modern theory with 2 guys, Irish laborers, William Burke and William Hare.
Yes, the 2 Williams.
Yep. And at that time period, it was popular for, let's say, the body snatchers, if you know what I mean.
Oh.
That people would go out, they would body snatch out of cemeteries, digging up the bodies to sell them to medical schools for profit. Now, the difference between those people and these 2 guys is that these 2 guys weren't grave robbing. They were going out and they were murdering people and then taking the bodies directly to the... So there's this theory that the 17 miniature coffins and the figurines were a tribute to the victims who never received a proper burial because of Burke and Hare.
Right. And Burke and Hare is absolutely one of my favorite macabre. I
love that one.
Of the Georgian period. If folks are not familiar with Burke and Hare, there is a film, and while it's slightly comedic because it has Simon Pegg in it, it's actually really, really well done. And it's one of my favorite films, and it's literally called Burke and Hare. But these 2 guys, let's just note, and I'm not doing this to pick and point, but they were 2 Irish immigrants in Edinburgh looking for work. So at that time, we're looking at, it's pre-potato famine period in Ireland, but it's also still under the, Northern Ireland's under the repression of England. And so people are not having the best of times in Ireland at this period. There's a lot of people out of work. So Burke and Hare leave and they go to Edinburgh looking for work. Now, did they look to become, the most well-known serial killers in Edinburgh's history? Probably not. But it kind of fell in their lap. So, and I say that because they met each other essentially at a rooming house. They were both living in a rooming house. And even though they were both Irish, they didn't know each other, as far as we know, prior to them meeting in Edinburgh at this rooming house. And what happened is the woman who owned the rooming house passed away naturally. And they decided to take her body and sell it because she didn't have any relations. She didn't have any relatives. There was nobody. She had no children, no living relatives. And they knew this because they were living in the house. So people talked and you got to know people. And they figured, what the heck? Like, we're not really doing anything wrong here. She's got no family to bury her. She's going to end up in a pauper's field. Nobody's going to know who she is. So they kind of took her body and sold it for medical the use of medical experimentation / learning, right? Because this is when we're first getting into cadavers being used to actually show medical students. And prior to that, you learned all your knowledge from a book. You had no hands-on experience.
Right.
So there was no apprenticeship. If you were a vet, you had to apprentice for 5 years, even in that time period.
Oh my goodness.
And 5 years under the tutelage of a veterinarian so that you could learn your craft. But as a medical doctor, you could literally roll into school, buy your degree, read some books, go out.
No way.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
We're not surgeons, right? So if you needed surgery, you went to the dentist because the dentist / barber / surgeon. Hence, we have the other's tale of Sweeney Todd.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But it was kind of, and a ship's carpenter on board a ship was often the ship's doctor / surgeon as well. So this is at a time period where modern medicine is really not very modern.
Yeah.
Especially in places like England and in the UK in general, and throughout a lot of spots in Europe. Now, if we get into the eastern part of the world, in China and Egypt and the Middle East, they were eons ahead in terms of their medical abilities. And it's like night and day. It's literally the dark ages in Europe while these other countries are doing, brain. They're actually doing brain, like relieving pressure on the brain and doing things like trepanning, where they're cutting a hole in the skull to relieve pressure. All of these things with tools made from obsidian, which are so sharp that they make the most beautiful, precise cuts. So now we have this weird juxtaposition, right? So now we've got these guys running around Edinburgh at the turn of the century, and they've discovered a new calling, which is bodies, the selling of bodies. So Burke and Hare actually do murder 17 people. The majority of them are women.